Mani, can you make him the co-host, please? And guys, if you can just get on the camera, because it's very, whole day I was just looking at some blank thumbnail pictures and it's so boring. If you can, yes. Yeah, it's visible, yeah.
So, just trying to do, let's see. It's always a little, yeah, let's see how this one works. What are you seeing right now?
Your intro, Josh Neufeld, comics journalism, and your presentation is visible, yeah.
Are you seeing like presenter notes or just a portion?
Yes, so what's comic journalism? Yes.
But okay, you are seeing that. And like down here, I am known for my nonfiction.
Yes.
All right, let me try to fix this.
Yeah, I forgot to mention something in your mail. Just it would be great if you can mention your New Orleans story as well.
Okay.
Just, you can talk about it because that's my favorite.
Oh, thank you. I'm trying to define the what I share and what I'm not sharing so I can use my presenter notes. Oh, there we go.
Yes.
So now
full
is it
screen.
just showing?
Yeah, full screen. Yes.
Okay, so you're not seeing the presenter notes anymore.
No, it's full screen.
Okay, great.
Yeah, it's full screen. Yeah.
Okay, so I'm set. I think you can hear me. Okay.
Yes, all good. 5 more minutes, please, if you can.
Sure.
But can I ask you something into the Idris Elba's thing? Just how do you do that? With pandemics, the intro is with Idris Elba.
How did I? I'm sorry. How did I do what?
Do we have to talk to him before we do that, or?
Oh no! From the Tale of Two Pandemics. I can talk about that later. Actually, how I was able to get that information. Yeah, I can go into detail about that. The process behind that particular story.
That would be great.
But no, I didn't interview him personally. I used that information. I used that quote from a Twitter video that he posted.
Sunil, we haven't met. Sunil, I'm Dave.
Hi. I'm basically a cartoonist for working for. I'm also a graphic novelist.
Oh, okay.
So I do a little bit animations and political cartoonings and
great, excellent.
For Asia, will they have a political?
Oh yeah, Sunil, I saw today. Yeah, it's amazing. What Kerala politics? Hey.
Nice to meet you.
Yeah. I saw that that last person, was 1 foot in the sack of Amit Shah. That's yours, right?
Yeah, it's right.
Yeah.
I do some animations for some for Asia will site. If you see like political and small animations.
Yeah.
Do you have a website I can look at to see your stuff?
No, actually, I am basically an engineer. And it was my passion, and recently I left all my job and started
Great.
it was a different journey, so I'm just doing. I will share some of my works, and definitely it is there in the Asia Will site, and I'm.
Josh, by the way, because he works for my boss, Shashikumar, and it's asiaville.com.
Okay.
Yeah, and I just saw that, it was amazing, about politics in Kerala, and that was, yeah, I just saw it.
Very cool.
Yeah. So very nice to meeting you.
Nice to meet you too. I wish
and check out Josh's works, please. Particularly because I prefer just the Tale of Two Pandemics is amazing. I don't know, it's out of this world. But my personal preference is New Orleans.
Yeah, that's the one. That's the one that most people know me from, for sure.
That's really nice to meet you, because I used to train for Asia.
Yeah.
So this is a class, a specific class of yours, Dev?
No, yeah, because in comics journalism, what I introduced your work. Let me put it in context, because I used because I don't illustrate things, so but I use tools. For example, I used something called the storyboard, where you don't need to know how to draw things like you guys.
Mm-hmm.
Then I also use a Google tool called Storyboard, an app where you can turn videos into comic strips. So you get the real face of people. And we use artificial intelligence for that. Then we use the cartoons, the story, the speech bubbles and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Because I'm not an artist. I can't even draw a line straight. So, and comics journalism is one of part of my module, and animation in comics journalism. And comics is it's a much maligned word. People think of Tom and Jerry, but after seeing your work, I was just blown over. Then the graphic novels from Africa, about genetical, that female, that mutilations and all this stuff. A lot of important works are being done from Nigeria, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Then your work, that pandemic, just blew me off.
Cool. I'm glad I came across the transom for you.
Yeah, and the thing is, the important thing is, just how to get it right. That's what I invited you for. That when you say comic, the word is okay. You make fun of people. The cartoon and comic is this non-fiction. What your work is, very completely different world.
There is also an existing debate on that, whether we should be using graphic novel or comic books. But I think that comic books are more political than graphic novels. I mean, the word, I mean.
Yeah, we haven't figured out the term here in the US either.
Right.
Here in India, it is still, a graphic novel is in a very premature stage, because it is not much people. In fact,
and Sunil, Josh, my problem is how to get the balance right, because you can't be too hilarious here when you're talking about pandemics. You can't be hilarious when you're talking about say that ABC created that Madea mom. Say a mother caught up between ISIS and the Syrian government. It's completely graphics. So a mother's face, you don't need a face. It can be any mother. So you can't make fun of people, So how do you get that balance? It's so very delicate. That's what I'm interested in. How do you get that? I went over and over again your works, and it's very difficult, and I can't do that.
In India, it is still in a very premature stage. Not premature. People are still, either it will be too abstract, or narration. Basically, they are from the art school, so they bring a lot of abstract things, and which goes many times above your head, and it's not neither art nor storytelling nor a commercial or kind of a. So we have actually, now it's picking up. Now the new generation, especially the millennials and the gens, they are just getting more into this graphic novel kind of a thing. So it's a emerging thing now.
Ari, for instance, is a really nice graphic novel that I really like.
Yeah, can you guys get on the camera for 1 second, please? As many as you can.
Good to see you, people.
In real life. Okay, guys, this is Josh, and I don't think you need any introduction because I've been talking about your work for the last 3-4 years. And it's an honor to have you here, Josh. So self-introduction, rather than me reading out something from your LinkedIn profile or Twitter profile, just I'll leave it to you. They're all yours.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you very much. Hello, everybody. Good to see you. Yeah, I know as a teacher, it makes a big difference for me when I can actually see the people I'm talking to as opposed to black screen. So I appreciate it. Should I just jump right into presenting some of my work and talking about comics journalism? Does that sound good? Okay. So try this again. I don't know if I chose the right thing there. There's always technical issues, right? There we go, right? You guys are seeing this? All right, so what is comics journalism? I actually did this piece originally for an Indian newspaper, The Mint. The editor was Dilip Cherian. I don't know if you know his work, but he's edits a lot of comics journalism stories that are published in India. So I did this piece for him to describe what is a comics journalist. I'll read you part of it. So I'm a comics journalist. The typical responses I get to that information are, or, oh, you write about comics for a newspaper or a magazine? Actually, I'm just like any other kind of journalist, except I tell my stories in comics form. No superheroes, no funny animals, just real stories about real people. And comics don't have to be funny, though humor is a part of real life too. I've mostly done stories about political and social upheaval told through the voices of witnesses. I think comics have a unique power to bring the reader into my subjects' minds and experiences. After all, a picture is worth at least 999 words. But why comics? In my view, the comics form particularly lends itself to this sort of in-depth treatment. And they really can tell any kind of story. To me, comics offer the reader a uniquely intimate experience. There are some things that you can convey in comics that you can't express only in words. The medium's unique combination of pictures and text and the fragmented narrative of the panel-by-panel format engages the reader in a particularly active role of interpretation and inference. It doesn't crowd out the reader's imagination. I'm often on the lookout for people whose particular experiences would translate well into the comics form through action and stories which can be portrayed in scenes rather than through boring verbal recaps, like talking heads. It's much more interesting to tell a story, to show a story rather than tell a story in comics form. And subjects and characters whose stories are told that way through action and dialogue create an effect of intimacy and shared experiences that really sticks in the mind of readers. People often ask how I get my stories. Well, the same way other journalists do. For my book on New Orleans and Hurricane Katrina, I went down to that region on 9 separate occasions over a 4-year period. I interviewed my subjects in person. I made lots of sketches. I took tons of photos and performed hours and hours of research. And I can talk a little bit about the specifics behind a story, The Tale of Two Pandemics, a little bit later if you're interested. So over my comics journalism career, I've done all sorts of different kinds of stories. I've done them, for instance, on the Syrian refugee crisis, and ethnic racial profiling at the border, the Canadian border, that is. I've reported on episodes in the 2010 Arab Spring and on the Trump presidency. I've also done stories on what appear to be more lighthearted topics. But when you dig down beneath the surface, these stories reveal themselves to have more weight. And recently I've done stories on the 2020 US Census and its utilization of differential privacy. And before publishing A Tale of Two Pandemics, I did a piece about my brother last summer, who is the deputy emergency manager of a New York cancer hospital. And it dealt with what my brother considered to be the worst day at the height of the pandemic here in New York. So back in March, almost exactly a year ago. And it showed what the people who work behind the scenes do and how vital they are to the people and the institutions who are on the front lines. Incidentally, that story also appeared in The Dispatch, a newsletter produced by the Azim Premji Foundation, for which I also illustrated this cover. I'm probably most well known for my long form projects like AD, New Orleans After the Deluge, The Influencing Machine, and Terms of Service. There's AD. So AD was about 6 real people who lived in New Orleans. Ooh, it was a long time ago now, back in 2005, when the flooding from Hurricane Katrina ravaged the city. And my job as a storyteller was to take those real people and make them into comic book characters, bringing them to life on the page. And this is a quick sort of recap of each of the characters and sort of what their experiences were, each of these real people who I call characters. So we had people from across the spectrum of the city, from different parts of the city, different economic backgrounds, different racial and ethnic backgrounds. Some of them stayed behind and dealt with the flooding. Some escaped and their homes were destroyed. Some had very little damage at all, but stayed to help people in the city. It was an attempt to tell all these different narratives, was to sort of give you a larger sense of the city as a whole. I'm gonna skip through this stuff. Another book I did was in collaboration with a pretty well-known radio journalist here in the US named Brooke Gladstone. And I was approached by her to collaborate on a new full-length project right when I was finishing AD. And it was like her manifesto on the media. In creating a comics format book on this subject, I was intrigued by Brooke's hypothesis that the intimacy of radio, the feeling of a narrator speaking directly to you, the listener, is very closely approximated by the word balloon. And that similar sense of connection, that direct feeling of connection between you and the character in a comic book that you're reading about. Essentially, Brooke's thesis about the media is that it is a reflection of society rather than a driver for it. As she puts it early on, what we're dealing with is a mirror, an exalting, degrading, tedious, and transcendent funhouse mirror. And as Brooke's avatar, drawn by me, takes the reader through the history of media, she shows how it's always really been that way and probably will continue to be even as more of us become part of the media through mobile technology, cell phone cameras, social media platforms like Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, etc. And actually that book was recently reissued just last month with a new cover and new material inside to take stock of the Trump era without letting him hijack the narrative. And with terms of service, I worked with journalist Michael Keller to look at big data, consumer rights, and personal privacy. We did this for Al Jazeera America. And as we ask in the piece, who gets to tell a story about you? Whether it's your car insurance company deciding how good a driver you are, or an employer judging how good a fit you'll be based on your social media profile. It's like all of these amalgamations of who you are as seen through the eyes of big data create this image of you that's not who you would like to be, how you would necessarily like to be represented out there. And for most of us, this database includes at least one fact that you really don't want anyone to know. So it's all these other institutions and platforms that tell the story of who you are rather than you getting to tell that story yourself. And I know in other countries, I'm not sure what this state is like in India, but there are these new privacy laws and the right to be forgotten and things like that that we are still dealing with here in the US. And this project was eventually translated into three languages, French, German, and also Chinese. So that brings us to my most recent piece, A Tale of Two Pandemics. I'm not gonna, Dev says that you guys have already read the piece, so I'm not gonna read through the whole thing with you, but just to cycle through it, it basically is the story of these three doctors, here in the US, who wrote an article for the Annals of Internal Medicine, comparing the health inequities that are happening here in the US with African Americans' access to proper care related to COVID, and the echoes of that from 100 years ago with the 1918 influenza pandemic. So basically I took an article that they had written, and then I interviewed them, and I turned it into a piece that talks about how those same issues are playing out now in 2020, 2021. And this is how the piece looks when it was broken up into smaller fragments, but if you saw it in its original form, it was presented in typical panel by panel, page by page format. And I can talk about how it all came together if you're interested. So that's sort of, that's a quick overall presentation. So I don't know if you want me to just jump right into talking about the process behind a typical piece, or if you'd like to ask some questions first, or however you want to proceed.
How would you like him to proceed, guys?
We could start with your process.
Okay, sounds good. So the piece started obviously with research. Well, first of all, as a human on this planet, during the pandemic, we're all going through this and learning about not only the disease, but the way that it's been processed and experienced by multiple different groups. And if you pay attention to the news at all, I'm sure in your country it's the same, that there's mass inequities, huge inequities between various groups as to how they're affected by COVID, and how not only by health, but by their economic prospects and forced migrations and all sorts of issues. So I already had done a lot of background research just by being alive and connected to what was happening. But to get started on this piece, which was commissioned by an editor at Journalist Resource, who I'd worked with before, she proposed that I do this piece on the pandemic, and already had identified this article as sort of the jumping off point. So I read the story, obviously, that was written by the three doctors, Lakshmi Krishnan, S. Michelle Ogonwale, and Lisa Cooper. And then I interviewed all three of them. So just like we're doing today, I did Zoom interviews with them, you know, got further quotes from them, talked to them about the article, got their permission, obviously, to, you know, have them represented in the story. That's always a really key thing for me, obviously, is to make sure that the people I'm talking to for a story understand that they're going to be represented as comic book characters. And I try to be as honest and straightforward with them as I can about what that process will be like, and show them samples of my other work so they kind of get a sense. Because like as Dev was saying, back when I first did AD, one of the characters in the story, Michelle, I'm sorry, Denise, was under the impression that, you know, it was going to be a humorous take on what had happened to her in New Orleans with Hurricane Katrina, because her understanding of what comics were was that they were always funny. And so I had to explain, no, there's a whole tradition of serious comics, of nonfiction comics. I'm going to treat your story very seriously, and I'll, you know, use quotes from you, and I'll, you know, work with you to make sure that you feel you're being represented fairly. And so now, you know, 15 years later, there's much more appreciation for the fact that comics can tell all sorts of stories here in the US, at least. It's not as much of a hurdle to convince somebody that I'm gonna, you know, be respectful to their story. So anyway, I did those interviews. I did more research after doing the interviews, as I'm sure any of you have known who've written journalism. You know, each round of interviews and research kind of unpacks more information that needs to be gathered. And so for me, that process of reporting is a very in-depth and serious process. I don't just jump right into drawing the comic right away. I do extensive research, and then I write a script. This is an example of what the script looks like. And I use a program called Scrivener for it, which enables me to like collect all the material that I'll be using and divide it up and keep it separate from the main script. But this writing and scripting process alone probably took at least a month, between, you know, me doing a number of drafts of it, and then sharing it with my editor and having her and her team look at it, and us deciding, you know, what information needed to be in there, what was problematic, fact checking, all of those kinds of things needed to be done before I ever started drawing. And again, for me, I always tell my editors, I want to get the script like really locked in before I start drawing, because it's much easier for me to do revisions in the scripting process than it would be to go back after I've already started to draw something. Someone asked if I could say the name of the software that I use. It's called Scrivener. I'll type it. And it is a pretty low cost program. I think it costs like $50 US, which here in the States is extremely low priced for software. And it's a really, it's a really nice product, because it integrates very well with Microsoft Word or Google Docs, but enables you to, it's very adaptable to whatever form you're writing in. You can use it for writing film scripts, for writing a novel, for writing journalism stories. But the best thing about it is it just enables me to kind of keep all of my research and reference material together in one place, but then also separate them out so I don't get lost in some giant file. It's kind of like a file organization system and a writing program at the same time. So that's the scripting. And then the next step is the drawing phase. Once, like I said, once the script is all locked in, first thing I do, especially with the main characters, because I've talked about how much I feel like the audience really like projects themselves into these characters whose stories that we're following. And that's exactly what I want to happen, because I think really the point of using comics to tell journalistic stories is to create this sense of empathy and connection with the people whose real stories you're learning about. So I then created comics versions of my three main characters. So you can see here, this is how they showed up. That's what they looked like in real life, and that's how they looked as comics characters. And then I go to the layout and pencil stage. So actually, for this project, this is one of the first projects that I did entirely digitally, because for my whole career, I've been a very typical analog cartoonist. And I drew pencil on paper and pen and ink and brush. But for this project, over last summer, I figured it was time for me to get up to speed with what a lot of people are using now, a lot of cartoonists are using as their tools. So I got an iPad Pro and the Procreate program for that, and that's what I drew this project in, and was able to download brushes that really mimic the look of what my brush stroke looks like in my normal comics. So that was what the pencils look like, and so now you can see the distinction between what the inks look like, the more developed pencils. And again, these, like at this stage, I would also send this to my editor and have them check it out and decide if they felt like it was, you know, if it was appropriate, if it was reflecting reality, if it conveyed what we had talked about we were looking for in the actual comic. And so then that was the inks, and then this was the colors. And you may have noticed, if you've seen any of my other work, that I typically use a pretty restricted color palette, a reduced color palette. And part of that is to, again, get away from what people's expectations of comics are. Because if you've read a lot of comics when you were young, especially European and American comics, you associate them with these very bright and garish colors that kind of scream out at you, this is not real, this is fantasy, you know. Even though they're realistic, they're so oversaturated and so dynamic that they really kind of take away from the sense of connection to our own lives. So I try to use a reduced palette that kind of lowers the temperature overall and kind of reminds you constantly that these are regular people just like you and me, and these are real stories. So ironically, by making the colors less realistic, I feel like it creates more of a sense of human connection. And so I use reference throughout this whole project. For instance, in the opening section where I show Idris Elba, the actor, talking to his followers on Twitter about the dangers of COVID for African Americans, I got screen captures of his actual Twitter video, and those are what I used as the basis for drawing him in those scenes. Same thing with some characters who show up in the story, historical real people. I found reference photos for them that I used to draw them in the comic, and so on and so forth. These are other people real people who showed up in the story, so you can see the reference that I used and then how it was used when they showed up in the comic. Same thing with celebrities, even like Ariana Grande, who was at a Black Lives Matter protest in the summer. And I had a photo from that, and so I used that in that image as well. And even going down to like social media posts that were featured in the comic. Again, I found the actual posts themselves to make sure not only that they're accurate, what I'm representing is true, but also to really give you a sense and a feel of what that, it's like we all are familiar with these kinds of messagings. And so when you see it in a comic, you connect with it and you relate to it and know that this is the way information is spread nowadays. And part of my job as a cartoonist, especially with stories that have to do with statistics or kind of dry information, is trying to find a way to bring them to life and make them more impactful, while at the same time not making any concessions to reality. So for instance, this statistic which shows the impact of COVID, like the mortality rate for African Americans compared to other groups in the United States, I wanted to really highlight like what a huge disparity it is, particularly between like Black deaths and white deaths. And so I blew out and sort of three-dimensionalized the chart, but at the same time, it doesn't change the reality of like the actual ratios there. And here are more examples of reference that was used. You know, right down to every single panel might have like 3 items of reference within it. And again, these kinds of things are very important for me to get that verisimilitude. So like the logo of the Afro-American, the newspaper, a Black newspaper, the actual article that is an example that one of the doctors is talking about. What a street scene looked like in Philadelphia in the late 1700s. Famous pieces of artwork that I reproduced to sort of show how much our sense of what is good and right have changed in just a few decades. Pictures from the US Public Health Service during the Tuskegee experiments. An ambulance, you know, from a certain county, and what like every municipality has its own types of ambulances, its own types of branding, and I wanted to make sure to get that stuff correct. So as you can see, this kind of attention to detail is something that I hold that it really matters to me when I'm taking these stories and bringing them to life. And then finally, just talking about color again, the way I use it in this story is hopefully something that readers just kind of like understand and appreciate without maybe even noticing. So one of the things that I did, like this is a typical page, is I used a pale blue color for any caption boxes where this was my voice as the narrator or as the author of the piece. And then if it was the doctors who are being quoted, or if they're you know, from either from their interviews or from their published writing, then that was this pale yellow. So that way nobody would get confused as to whether this was me saying something or whether this was a quote from them, no matter how it shows up in the story. The color would kind of give you that clue. And then whenever I use red in the story, which is very infrequently, it's to really call your attention to something either that's happening visually or that you need to see in the text itself, and is usually like a danger sign of some kind. And then finally, I used a separate color blue, sort of the typical blue used in surgical masks, because this was just a personal thing of mine. Because I don't know if you followed this, but in the US, there's been a huge political divide about wearing masks, and people who are on the side of Trump and the Republicans have tended to avoid wearing masks even when it endangers other people or themselves as some sort of political statement. I'm not sure what the statement actually is, but in any case, those areas where they don't wear masks have had much higher infection rates. And so it's just really important to me that people wear their masks. So I wanted to highlight whenever I showed anyone in a mask that they were indeed wearing one. So that was a separate color blue. And I think that is where I stop with the process behind that piece. And certainly if you have any questions or comments, I'm here to try to answer them.
Is it done completely by yourself, or you have some in terms of the data collection, or maybe, you know, discussing the script, or bringing the artwork? I mean, entire thing.
The artwork and all that research is totally by me. And I work with an editor on all of the script stuff and fact checking. And the editor has a team of colleagues who also were weighing in sometimes with questions or fact checking issues. We had some ethical debates about what we could show or what we couldn't show and things like that. So I always appreciate working with a good editor. Sometimes, as you may know, as being a cartoonist yourself, when you're sort of really invested in a project and working on it so intimately and closely, you sometimes don't have enough distance from it to be able to tell what's, you know, going to work or what's sort of crossing a line. So I always appreciate having an editor all throughout my work from the beginning till now. I always rely on editors. Someone asked how long this whole process takes. So I started research on that piece probably in July, and it was published in November. So I would say it took probably about a month and a half to do all the research and the writing and the scripting, and then probably another month and a half to do all of the artwork. And it's a 10-page story. So that's pretty typical. That might even be actually kind of fast for me because it takes me a while to draw every page, you know, with all of the stuff that goes into it.
Also, like, it's difficult knowing that it's people wouldn't be convinced that a comic journalism is a thing. But then when did you first decide to do such a thing? As in, when was the first time you do such a thing or created a comic thing and thought that it can be a non-fiction story also? Like, we have grown up seeing just superheroes and other things in a comic book. Then when was the first time you decided that you could do something extra, something other than the normal thing?
Yeah, for me, it took a long time. Like I grew up as a kid drawing superhero comics, and those were the only comics that I really knew. And like comics like Tintin, you know, from Belgium. And so everything was fictional. But when I got into my early 20s, I discovered a cartoonist, a writer named Harvey Pekar, who did a comic called American Splendor, which is just entirely not like real life stories about his life, his very mundane life. He was a file clerk at a hospital, and he had all these artists draw his work because he couldn't draw. And just reading those stories was so refreshing and mind-blowing for me. Like, oh my God, I can't believe you can tell these totally normal stories about regular people in comics form. There's no battles, there's no superheroes, there's no guns. This is just the things that happen to all of us in our normal lives. And it really opened my eyes as to what the potential of the comics form was. Because from that moment on, like I saw that there were so many possibilities for this form. And then I read the work of Joe Sacco, who's really well known for doing comics journalism. Books like Palestine and Safe Area Garajda and lots of other works of journalism in comics. And that was when the door really opened for me. I started doing nonfiction comics, you know, in my mid-20s, and then I started just dipping my toe into journalistic comics, mostly working with another writer around that same time. And then when after Hurricane Katrina happened, I really went down the path of doing almost exclusively comics journalism. So that was in the late 2000s. So like 2007 is when I started with AD, and I've been pretty much doing that ever since.
Yeah, you are following Marjana Satrapi?
Yeah. I love her book Persepolis. I don't think of that as journalism as much as memoir, but you know, it's very much in the same category of Harvey Pekar and Art Spiegelman with Mouse. You know, there's Alison Bechdel with Fun Home. There's a great tradition of doing nonfiction comics, nonfiction graphic novels.
Yeah.
It's kind of a contradiction in terms, but those, you know, along with Harvey Pekar, were very influential for me, and just and they've been very impactful in the United States. Like a lot of people in this country grow up reading books like March by John Lewis about the civil rights movement, or Fun Home or Mouse. So they're now more and more people grow up just accepting that comics can be about real life things.
And you follow Luinick also? Luinick?
Who's that?
Luinick. Australian cartoonist.
I think I know that.
Luinick. I'll just try it. I think Leunig.
Oh, I'll check it out. There's so much out there besides what we see in the US, you know. We're very limited.
Yeah, Shruti Vishruti, Mayuri, you can ask directly rather than putting in the chat. Josh, they are putting a lot of questions in the chat.
Oh yeah, okay. So let's see, we've got one. Have you ever gotten into trouble for taking a dig at a political leader or while addressing controversial issues? I don't really do a ton of comics that are like like on the scale of talking about, well, I did do the piece on Trump. I mean, here in the US, it's just so normal to be able to, you know, there are very few restrictions on the press. So you can pretty much say whatever you want about a public figure as long as it's not libel, you know, as long, or slander, as long as you're not lying about anything that they've done, or, you know, exaggerating, saying someone killed someone if they only you know, did something less than that. So since my work very much sticks to the facts, I don't worry about those kinds of things. I never, and I'm not the type of person who would, I don't do political cartooning. You know, it's a very different type of field. In political cartooning, you're deliberately exaggerating things for effect, or making, you know, allusions or connections to things. And those are the kinds of things that I try to avoid. I don't editorialize in my comics as much as let the people whose voices I choose tell those stories or say those kinds of things. So that's not it's not an area that I'm really worried about. Someone else said, do you like working with humor or caricaturing personalities as satire? Again, those are what I think is like a very different field than mine, which is political cartooning. So even though I may run across people who do that at a convention or a festival, that's just not the arena that I'm in. So, and I don't think, you know, I respect those people because that's a really difficult job, what they do, but it's a different skill set. And so I don't tread in that territory because I wouldn't be as good at it as they are. I think that covers the questions that were in the chat. If anyone wants to ask any other questions in real life, feel free.
Hey guys, you can ask him directly rather than putting it in the chat.
I know one person said they have a problem with their speaker.
Yeah, measure audience and Shruti.
How do I measure audience reception to the comic strip? Journalism. You mean like, how do I know whether it's being read or being, how it's being received? So my books have done very well. Like, so that tells me something. They've sold well. They've been translated into a number of languages. I've been invited to speak at colleges that have adopted the book as a common read in a number of places. I was invited by the U.S. State Department to travel to countries all over the world to talk about my work and to talk about comics journalism. So it's had quite an impact that I've been very gratified to see, because, you know, I mean, for me, it really is about people's stories. It's not about it's not about me as an author as much as it is, like, you know, bringing these stories to a wider audience through comics. And the piece, The Tale of Two Pandemics, was published under a Creative Commons license. So basically anybody, any organization is allowed to reprint it as long as they just notify the original publisher of that. So I really like that sort of arrangement that Journalist Resource has created, because it enables the work to get out to as large of an audience as possible without anybody having to worry about having to pay for it. Because of the amount of effort put in, do you still put it up on free platforms? Yes. Well, I get paid for it. Yeah. I am paid personally, which is always nice. I have to make a living just like everybody else. So yeah, I mean, like, for instance, Journalist Resource, which paid for The Tale of Two Pandemics, they had received money from a grant from a foundation to produce innovative works on health policies. And so that's where the money came from for that particular piece.
Mm-hmm.
I have a silly question. Can I ask?
No question is silly, sure.
Yeah, so in your book, The Vagabonds, you actually mentioned that you and there was this character, I'm forgetting the name, you both were taken in by a family of Baptist missionaries. So
Oh, yeah. Mm-hmm.
How was the encounter? I mean, because there it showed that you had different, I mean, new perspectives came to you, you changed your perspectives regarding religion and all that. So I really wanted to know from you, how was that and how it changed you as a person, as in did it or did it not?
Wow, you're really going back in time. That's a piece that the story you're referring to is an autobiographical story I did about traveling with my wife in Southeast Asia, long time ago. So I was very young.
The copy I have, that's your copy that I have.
Wow.
So I really wanted to know about that.
Yeah, that was so before I was doing journalism, I was doing like memoir and autobiographical comics. But again, all the stories in them were real life stories. So what she's referring to is a trip I was on with my girlfriend when we were maybe in our like 22, 23 years old. And we were backpacking in Thailand, and we ended up in this very remote part of Thailand to see a Buddhist festival. And when we got to the city, there were no accommodations available. It was like off the grid in a lot of ways. And we didn't have anywhere to stay. We hadn't made any reservations in advance, and we just didn't know. We didn't speak Thai, and we were totally lost. And somebody saw us as the only white people in the whole area and said, okay, I'm going to take them to the other white people I know. So they took us, a very nice cab driver took us to this missionary's house, these Baptist missionaries who had set up camp in that city, and deposited us on their front lawn. And from then the story took place, which was that they very kindly took us in and let us stay with them for a couple of days. And because I'm not Baptist, I'm not religious at all, actually, and my girlfriend at the time wasn't either, we both had these preconceptions and I guess even prejudices, you might say, against missionaries, against evangelical Christians that we had gotten from the news and from political debates going on in the United States. And so we were forced to kind of confront those preconceptions with what these people were actually like. And it was a really eye-opening experience. It didn't change my feelings about missionaries and about religion in general, but it opened me up to not being from being closed off or having preset expectations about people just based on what their religion was. So it was a really important period for me. I think a lot of what my 20s was about like losing a lot of my beliefs and kind of opening up to actually meeting people where they are coming from, as opposed to what I thought they were like without even talking to them.
Thank you.
Sure. Long-winded. Sorry about the long-winded answer.
No, actually, I wanted that. Thank you.
Oh, good.
Your take on the Charlie Hebdo shooting?
What are you gonna, what can you say? It was horrible. I mean, for one thing, I don't think any cartoonist goes into this job thinking that they're putting their life in danger just by making some drawings on a piece of paper. I mean, as Robert Crumb, the famous cartoonist, said, it's just ink on paper, people. So I mean, it's just horrifying to think that people were so outraged by, what they considered blasphemy, I guess, that they would go into an office of a newspaper and kill how many people? 15 people and 5 cartoonists, I think. I mean, I just can't condone that kind of response. I can understand like being offended by something that a cartoonist does, but if you're offended, then you should make a cartoon that offends them. You shouldn't kill them with a machine gun, So there's appropriate levels of response, and that was obviously way beyond anything that could be considered acceptable. I mean, it's a separate issue, I think, about what is what's the obligation of a cartoonist. Again, this is out of my purview, but I think that cartoonists should be respectful towards their subjects, and not deliberately provocative, not deliberately attempt to offend entire millions of people. But there's always a fine line between offending a religion and offending an institution of a religion, I guess, is sort of the way to think about it.
Thank you, sir.
Well, I don't know if there's more questions or whether you want to wrap things up or what we're at.
Yeah, anything else, guys? Anything else? Yeah. Looks like that's pretty much it. Can you just briefly just conclude this by, Josh, if I have a question, that the difference between a cartoon and your work?
Well, again, this is a problem with the lexicon or with the terminology, because here in the US, we call everything comics, whether it's funny or not. And of course, the word comic, means humorous. And it's further confused by the fact that people who make comics call themselves cartoonists, but the people who make cartoons are called animators. So, that's that's a whole other problem. And I think we were talking about right at the beginning, you could call it a graphic novel, but if the Tale of Two Pandemics is only 10 pages long, that's not a novel. It's a story. So
it's like a reporting, right? It's essentially graphic nonfiction reporting. Like people write, people do documentaries, people make podcasts.
Right. It's just another form of nonfiction storytelling, and that's kind of. I call myself a nonfiction cartoonist, and I hope that if people are familiar with that term, or that form of nonfiction comics, then they know what I am. But otherwise, like I said in the piece, then they just are like, okay, whatever, let's talk about baseball or something, because they don't have any idea what I'm talking about, So you just meet people where they are, and hopefully people who are curious will read this stuff and discover that there's a whole other world of comics out there. Then
any advice, Josh, for upcoming people, these young people would like to enter this world, your world?
I guess the advice would be that you can't just jump right into this sort of stuff without, at least I feel ethically that it's really important that I do my reporting in a really respectful and engaged and thorough way before I start drawing anything, because I really do want to make sure that I'm telling these stories as truthfully as possible, while at the same time understanding that there are a lot of creative leaps that need to be made when you start drawing, your comics, that you have to make up a lot of stuff. But at the same time, if there's a foundation of truth and reporting behind it, then I think you'll be in a good place. So just do the journalistic work as well and as thoroughly as you can, and then the comics part kind of will take care of itself. That's how I feel.
So apply the same rigor, right? That
exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. So yeah, I
Thank you
hope
so
this
much.
has been interesting to all
It
of you.
is amazing. It's just a new world for us. And thank you so much. It's been an honor. It's an honor to host you.
Well,
And
thank you.
would you like sharing this presentation with us, and also that I can share with them?
Yeah. Do you want me to like save it as a PDF or as a PowerPoint, or what would you? What would you like?
PDF would be fine.
PDF?
Josh.
Okay. Yeah,
Okay.
I can do that.
How to be in
Thank
touch
you.
with you, like your email ID or what is?
Yeah. Here,
I have. I'll share.
Yeah.
you can contact me through my website.
Josh,
I have contact information there.
Yeah. Fine. Okay.
All right. Well, thank you guys.
Yeah. Thank you
Nice
very
to
much indeed.
connect across the continents, across the world.
Yeah. Go on.
Have a good evening.
Yeah, you too. Yeah, have a good day.
All right. Bye-bye.